Ian gave us a really great nuts and bolts rundown of the Constitution. Tonight, I'm going to be basically taking for granted that folks have some general background on the Constitution, more or less just thinking the Constitution is a problem and that we need a new, more democratic one. I won't really be engaging in that argument so much. I'm going to be engaging in a different one. So what we're going to do tonight is all talk using my PowerPoint for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll break off into discussion rooms. If Zoom is small enough, and right now it's relatively small, we could probably just have one Zoom room of folks, and then we'll also have a small discussion circle here. And again, if it's small, we can see how we go through the questions. Grant and Juan will be your discussion leads. They both have questions that we'll go through, and we'll take it from there. So, in part one of our series about the Constitution, Ian described the problem, right? The problem is that the U.S. is not a democracy because of its undemocratic Constitution. And tonight, what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss why the left has to fight for a democratic constitution. So all this talk about democracy and the Constitution, it all falls under what I'm going to call democratic republicanism. And that is briefly the idea that the ideal state, that a democratic state, is one in which unimpeded lawmaking power lies in a unicameral legislature, which means one house, with representatives elected by universal and equal suffrage, meaning that everyone can vote and that no one's vote counts more than anyone else's. That's the definition of universal and equal suffrage. Marx and Engels, who we'll talk more about, they didn't invent democratic republicanism or the struggle for universal and equal rights. They adopted democratic republicanism before actually becoming communists, and they made socialism political by adding the strategy of achieving a democratic republic. For a long time, the working class movements that existed, their foremost demand was for a democratic republic, and they agitated for it. Engels, when he was writing later on in his life in 1881, as he explained, it was really just common knowledge that, and this is his quote, democracy means the dominion of the working class, neither more nor less. And really, what I'm trying to emphasize is that working class politics was the struggle for political democracy. And that can be seen perhaps most clearly in the English Chartists, who I won't really go into, but they're a very interesting historical example of all this. Marx and Engels spent their entire political career struggling for democracy. And towards the end of his life, he explained, I'd have to imagine maybe a little bit exasperated, that Marx and I have repeated ad nauseum that the democratic republic is the only political form in which the struggle between the working class and the capitalist class can first be universalized and then culminate in the decisive victory of the proletariat. However, the democratic republicanism of classical Marxism lost after the Russian Revolution. The result was a very steep decline in constitutional agitation. But what I want to emphasize, and as you can see by the title of my presentation, was lost is the key phrase, right? Was lost. Because, as I'll explain, the struggle for democracy has been going on for a long time, and it is still continuing. And so, as a result, this talk is going to cover a lot of ground. It's going to be broken into two parts. Part one is going to center on America in the 1960s and two movements, the Civil Rights Movement and the New Left, that were really personified by two people, in particular Martin Luther King Jr. and Tom Hayden, who both struggled to change our country's political structure. And the actors in part one will notice they might use words like justice, liberty. They're also going to use phrases like human rights and human degradation. Also in the 1960s, we'll meet Hal Draper and some other characters too. Hal Draper reintroduced Lenin's democratic republicanism. And from there, as we'll see, the ball has just really kept rolling. Part two of my talk is going to follow folks like Draper, who changed a few minds here and a few minds there, and who are really primarily responsible for the present moment that I'm going to describe. And part two is take us to other countries and other periods. Folks are going to use words like bourgeoisie and autocracy. They're also going to use phrases like dictatorship of the proletariat and manifestations of the reigning reaction. So I do recognize that the transition between these two sections might feel a little jarring, right? Because they're going to include different people, they're going to include different places, times, and sometimes they're going to include different jargon. It's going to include different jargon. My point, though, is that the actors are really speaking a common language of universal and equal rights, and that everyone in our story really wants the same thing, which is a democratic state and self-governance. And the connecting thread that's going to tie all these struggles together is really going to be the struggle for political freedom. And it's going to tie all this to our own contemporary struggle. So we have Martin Luther King Jr., we have Tom Hayden. Martin Luther King and Tom Hayden were the figureheads of two concurrent movements for democracy in the United States: Civil Rights Movement, the New Left. King, you probably know a lot about King. He was the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, among a lot of other things. Tom Hayden, he was the president of Students for a Democratic Society for a year between 1962 and 1963. He was also the author of SDS's Port Huron Statement. And the Port Huron Statement was one of the most influential, probably the most influential document to come out of the New Left. I'm going to start with King and the Civil Rights Movement. So as a 26-year-old minister, remarkably young, King began his career linking the burgeoning civil rights movement to the supreme law of the land, as he called it. And he exclaimed in very incredible oratory, "We're wrong in what we're doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of the nation is wrong. If we're wrong, the Constitution of the US is wrong." A few years after that, he calls the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence great wells of democracy. And he also calls them later on promissory notes to which every American was going to fall heir, regardless of the color of their skin. However, and it's an important however, King never expressed a genuine belief in the legitimacy of the Constitution. Unlike countless presidents, he never praised the guardrails that the framers created in the Constitution. He shared little to nothing in common with James Madison. James Madison extolled the US's Republican form of government as a means to frustrate what he called any interested and overbearing majority and to disrupt the power of who he referred to as the people out of doors. And of course, King sounded nothing like Benjamin Rush, who said that a simple democracy is one of the greatest of evils. We know from Ian's presentation that the Constitution is designed to make swift and decisive action as difficult as possible. We also know, though, that King famously explained that wait has almost always meant never, right? He was a man of action. Freedom and justice were King's guiding lights. And in his letter from Birmingham jail, he appealed to St. Augustine. And St. Augustine was the one who said that an unjust law is no law at all, and that any law that uplifts human personality is just, but that any law that degrades human personality is unjust. So I'd argue that if the Constitution facilitated the pursuit of freedom and justice, it was good in King's eyes, and when it impeded those goals, it was not. So we turn now to kind of the flow of history. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 marked the peak of optimism for the civil rights movement, right? And MLK called it a shining moment, and he even thought that maybe the Voting Rights Act would make it so that mass protests were unnecessary. This was the end. They'd done it. You know. 5 days, just 5 days after the Voting Rights Act became law, the Watts riots in LA began. And actually there would be riots every summer for the next summers. And later on, the Kerner Commission, a famous group of folks, they would conclude that the US was moving towards two societies. They very famously said this line, two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. King, though, I think didn't really need an official report to tell him what was going on, right? And he said the quality and quantity of discrimination and deprivation in our nation is so pervasive, this is what he's saying, that all changes of a decade have merely initiated preliminary alterations in an edifice of injustice and misery. So this is King after he's done all of this work. All of this is only preliminary alterations, right? The struggle absolutely has to continue. By 1967, King is at a very low period. He really feels like he's run out of answers. And his wife, Coretta, tells him that they're going to come in time. It's in the context of this frustration and really increasing despair that King is feeling that for the first time, he explicitly questions the Constitution. And he does that in what will turn out to be his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Unity. It's in that book that King writes, he says, we've had constitutional backing for most of our demands for change, and that this has made our work easier, so to be sure of legal support from the federal courts. He says, though, that now we're approaching areas where the voice of the Constitution is not clear. And he continues on and he says that the movement, the civil rights movement, has now left the realm of constitutional rights and it's entered the area of human rights. And this is a picture of the front of that book. The civil rights movement, as King was understanding it, changed the US from a system of non-universal, right, non-everyone can vote, and unequal suffrage, in which minoritarian checks, such as the Senate, existed alongside laws that were explicitly barring blacks from voting. That society changed to one of universal and unequal suffrage, right, in which the Constitution's minoritarian features were coexisting with expanded suffrage. And Ian talked a lot about those minoritarian features in his presentation. The hardwired elements of the Constitution, the presidential veto, the bicameral legislature, the powerful Supreme Court, all that stayed the same. That's what I really want to emphasize. All that stayed the same. Where do we go from here? Reading this book, it really surprised me when I read it for the first time. I was familiar with King. I knew about King's policy proposals, right, including his Economic Bill of Rights. However, I really didn't know that King had began questioning the possibility of those proposals being realized through the existing Constitution. And reading this book, what you realize is that King identified the boundaries of action within the limits of the existing Constitution. And what he did was he voiced those feelings out loud in the context of a mass political movement. And no one else in the 60s did that. So I want us to recognize that moment in the civil rights movement. I'll transition now over to the New Left and specifically focusing on Students for a Democratic Society and Tom Hayden. This is a picture of a small group of SDS folks in 1963. So Tom Hayden, gosh, at the time he would have been like 20 or so. He first met MLK in Los Angeles in 1960. He might have even been younger than 20. 2 years later, Hayden, who's gone through a lot of experiences, Hayden writes the Port Huron Statement. And the Port Huron Statement will turn out to be the most famous text to emerge from the New Left. The Port Huron Statement was really the political manifesto of Students for a Democratic Society. And I'm not going to describe SDS too much, just knowing that they're a predominantly student organization and they have a membership that tops 100,000 by 1968. So in the Port Huron Statement, Hayden says a lot of things, but he describes what he refers to as the permeating and victimizing fact of human degradation. And he says that's symbolized by the Southern struggle against racial bigotry, and also the what he calls the enclosing fact of the Cold War, symbolized most powerfully by the presence of the bomb. America, as he's pointing to, America is a country of affluence, right? But it's riddled with racism and greed, and it's really ruled by a powerful and unaccountable elite. And SDS's original idea of participatory democracy really combined a critique of America's incomplete democracy with a call to do something about it. In 1965, SDS organized what was then the largest protest against any war in US history, the war, of course, being the Vietnam War. There, Paul Potter, who was a founding member of SDS, he urged the folks who were there to do what he called naming the system, right? He told them to name the system that made the war possible. At another rally, the SDS president at the time, Carl Oglesby, gave a very important speech in which he criticized who he called the corporate liberals. And he said that unlike the humanist liberals, the corporate liberals had thrown aside Tom Paine, they'd thrown aside Thomas Jefferson, and they'd embraced what he called the menacing coalition of military and industrial power. I also want to bring in briefly C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills, a very iconoclastic sociologist, he really heavily influenced SDS, and it was in his work, The Power Elite, still a very famous book, that he described the domination of the military event, as he called it. And that military event was dominating the post-war American society. And he went on to say, many people, black and white, they understand that Congress has again abdicated to a handful of men decisions clearly related to the issue of war and peace. These folks know that the bomb was dropped over Japan in the name of the United States, although they were at no time consulted about the matter, right? They feel that they live in a time of big decisions. They know that they are not making any. One of my favorite quotes. I think that really encapsulates a lot of what it feels like to live in an undemocratic country. A lot of important decisions are being made, and one is aware they're not a part of those decisions. So I want to bring SDS and the civil rights movement together to sort of conclude the first part of my presentation. SDS and the civil rights movement, they really understood that the US had a democracy problem, right? And then they even sometimes knew a little bit more than that. Tom Hayden knew that the US was a republic, not a democracy, and he actually commented on the Constitution in a draft of the Port Huron Statement. Comment was actually cut out. Folks in the SDS felt that challenging the founding fathers would involve the SDS, still kind of a fledgling organization, really just too much controversy. And others emphasized the Constitution's preamble and the Bill of Rights, and they really saw the entire creation as something to strive towards, right? Something good towards. Others, SDS was a very diverse group of folks, others, those with more of an admitted formal socialist orientation, they found the question of democracy somewhat superstructural, and they considered it far less important than the relations of production. And I'm quoting a book there, hence the air quotes. So my point is that ultimately the civil rights movement, right, and the New Left, they really failed to cross the conceptual Rubicon. Both movements condemned imperialism and economic inequality. They both had a primary focus, right, on the immediate struggle to advance, but neither of them made a connection between their democratic values and the constitutional structure of the government. That's the point I really want to hammer home. No one, save for King, right at the very end, asked if democracy was possible in a country with an undemocratic constitution. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying this is a missed opportunity. As I'm going to explain, it's actually one that the left can and is connecting the dots around. So I'm going to take a sip of water to give us a little brief intermission after part one. Okay, let's launch into part two. So today, if we can look back on the 1960s and recognize, as we're doing, right, that there is a constitutional blind spot, that means something. Right? We can look back and we can recognize that for different reasons, the folks we talked about, all those actors, they were going about the chaos of their lives, lots of things were going on. They didn't see something that we now see. right? And that thing is that democracy cannot be realized through an undemocratic political system. Furthermore, we know that political power can't be dodged, right? In the US, to talk about political power is to talk about the Constitution. I think Ian really gave a great representation of that in his talk. The Constitution, I like to think of it as sort of like the proverbial elephant in the room, if you will. So someone might touch a leg, right? Or they might touch a trunk, but they can't really understand how all these pieces fit together. Once in a while, someone might realize that there's an elephant in the room, but they ultimately decide to look the other way for whatever reason, right? Maybe they think it's just simply too big. And I actually think Tom Hayden is sort of an example of this phenomena, in that we know he named the Constitution and then cut it from the Port Huron Statement draft. And for whatever reason, he dropped that topic. He went on to other things. Here, though, is the silver lining, right? Because if we can look back on the past, and if we can look back on the past and critique the past, it's because we now have the ideological tools that we need to solve the problem, right? So we see the elephant in the room. We can connect those limbs back to the larger whole. And I'd argue we are also ready and willing to face that problem. So to transition a little bit into part two, if not for King and Hayden, though, how is democratic republicanism making a comeback, right? Why do socialists want democracy? How did the left learn to see the Constitution again? So now we're going to continue on in time a little bit, and then we're going to take a farther dive back, and then we'll get into our questions. So in the 1960s, Hal Draper wrote The Myth of Lenin's Concept of the Party. And that work really presented Lenin as one of history's foremost revolutionary Democrats. Draper also worked contemporaneously with Richard N. Hunt. This is Richard's book here. His 1974 book, The Political Ideas of Marx and Engels, traced Marx and Engels' relationship with democratic republicanism. His book is the far one with the blue cover. Draper and Hunt were contemporaries of Neil Harding, and it was in Harding's 1977 book, Lenin's Political Thought, this center one here in the middle, where he wrote that according to Lenin, workers didn't have to come to what he called socialist consciousness to acquire political consciousness. So what I think that means is, in other words, Lenin didn't think someone needed to be a socialist to actually appreciate the need for democracy, and that actually the struggle for democracy was the primary struggle. Draper, Hunt, and Harding, they all did their part in debunking many of the myths of undemocratic Marxism that was peddled by the West and the Soviet Union. That's important to realize during the Cold War. Of course, this is still an ongoing project, right? Luckily, though, thanks to them, we know that dictatorship of the proletariat, right? It really just meant a state based on universal and equal suffrage. We also know that Lenin had really no model party outside of what was necessitated in Russia. And we know other things about Lenin and the Russian Revolution, thanks to them. And then 2006, Lars Lee, who had also read Hal Draper and Neil Harding, he published he published a book called Lenin Rediscovered: What's to be Done in Context. That's this one with the very colorful cover. And it was in that book that he wrote, the imperative necessity of political freedom is the central theme of Lenin's political agitation. And he continued on to say that if you were willing to fight for political freedom, you were Lenin's ally, even if you were hostile to socialism. He said, however, that if you downgraded the goal of political freedom in any way, you were Lenin's foe, even if you were a committed socialist. And as we're going to see, this belief of Lenin's, right, that establishing a democratic republic is paramount to the task of a working class movement, that is just simply orthodox Marxism, as we're going to get into. I want to touch on a few more folks, though. In 2011, in what was Jacobin Magazine's second ever issue, Seth Ackerman published an article titled "Burn the Constitution," in which he explained that the Constitution, as he says, makes it virtually impossible for the electorate to obtain a concerted change in national policy by a collective act of political will. Again, Ian described that in his presentation. In 2018, former SDS member Gil Schaefer wrote an essay about SDS and Lenin's democratic republicanism. That one was titled "You Can't Use Weathermen to Show Which Way the Wind Blew." And Schaefer also, it should be noted, developed his politics by reading Draper, Harding, also Lenin's political agitation, and just a lot of general US history. In 2021, DSA, right, the group that many of us are a part of, they took a small step forward towards confronting the Constitution by including the demand for a second convention and a call to abolish the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the Electoral College in their political platform. And there's a quote from that you all read. If you did read, no worries if you didn't, in the readings for this session. I will say, what I only realized just a few days ago is that it is really, though, the youth that are leading the way in many ways, because just last year, less than a year ago, at their convention, YDSA passed the resolution "Winning the Battle for Democracy." I didn't include that one in the readings. I wish I had. But that resolution raised the demand for a new and radically democratic constitution. It does a lot more. Really encourage folks to check that one out. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn to some representative statements of Marxism's classical democratic republican strategy. This is what people like Draper, Hunt, Harding, they were grappling with, right? It's also what convinced them of the centrality of democracy. And I also think it's what the left is starting to grapple with once again. So, does that load? Yes. That's Marx and Engels from the movie, the young Karl Marx. I almost forgot the name there. So this first quote is from The Principles of Communism, which was written by Engels in 1847, right? It was actually a draft of the Communist Manifesto. That's Engels there with the blonde hair. Asked about the course of a communist revolution, Engels says that above all, it will establish a democratic constitution, and through this, the direct or the indirect dominance of the proletariat. Flip back over to Marx here briefly. This next quote is from the Communist Manifesto, right? Marx wrote that in 1848. The manifesto, Marx says that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, to win the battle of democracy, right? He says the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, so on and so forth. Back to Engels here. This next one is from Engels's 1891 critique of the Erfurt program. It's a long story, but Engels is reading through the party of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, very famous party, the SPD. Engels reads through the program's political demands, and he says they have one great fault. And to paraphrase, he basically says, yeah, everything's great, but even if you got all these demands, you'd still be missing one big thing. Your political program would still be missing one big thing. And he explains then that one big thing is the democratic republic. He says, if one thing is certain, it's that our party and the working class can only come to power under the form of a democratic republic, right? That's even the specific form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, that big buzzword, as the Great French Revolution of 1793 has already shown. I won't really go down this rabbit hole, but I will note that Rosa Luxemburg discovers this critique in the early 1900s. It involves her and Karl Kautsky in a very important conversation, right? How the Social Democrats are reacting to all this. And I'm actually going to get in briefly to a conversation, an interaction between Rosa Luxemburg and Kautsky in a little while. Okay, Lenin. This is from The Fall of Eagles, great TV show. I knew I was going to blank on this actor's name. He's a very famous actor. Patrick Stewart, thank you. That's Patrick Stewart playing Lenin, I know. So this next quote is from the program of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Parties. It's a word for the RSDLP's 1903 program, right? The RSDLP is Lenin's party. It becomes the Bolsheviks, da, da, da. This program was unchanged until 1918, right? So they do the Russian Revolution with this in mind. Here, really, the Russians are really just echoing the standard Marxist demand for a democratic republic. And we'll see that. They provide, I'd argue, actually the most precise definition of democracy in the program that we're about to see. And it really is one that we in the US should aspire towards. And that if we're curious about a definition of democracy, I'd say what the Russians said way back when still stands. So the introduction to the political section of the program reads that the RSDLP takes as its most immediate political task the overthrow of the czarist autocracy and its replacement by a democratic republic, the Constitution, which would ensure, and then you got 14 points of political demands. Really, many of them are just classic liberal demands. The first point, though, reads that the sovereignty of the people, right, and I should say the Constitution of which would ensure the sovereignty of the people. That is the concentration of supreme state power wholly in the hands of a legislative assembly consisting of representatives of the people and forming a single chamber. Notice single chamber, that refers to a unicameral legislature, not a bicameral legislature. The second point in the program talks about universal and equal suffrage, elections to both the legislative assembly and to all the local organs of government, so on and so forth. Okay, that's Karl Kautsky. There is in the Rosa Luxemburg movie, which I'll show next, Karl Kautsky does make an appearance, but it's very short, so it was hard to capture. I couldn't really capture a screen grab of him. So this is an actual picture of Karl Kautsky. So in the early 1900s, the SPD and Kautsky in particular, they published a critique of the Third Republic of France, the French Third Republic. And this was the epitome of a bourgeois republic, as Kautsky explains. And it's a very important work because here Kautsky's really digging into a constitution that's very much like the one that we have in the United States. It's one that vests king-like power in the president. It also splits the legislature into two houses, right? Even with a malapportioned upper house, right? Meaning that the number of senators is not representative to the population of the area that they're representing. The government at the time, again, I will try not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but the government at the time was saying, oh, we're under threat by the right. We got to rally around the Constitution. We got to protect the Constitution that we have. Let's all come together. Let's all form up. It's a really interesting read. It seems to be consistently relatable to contemporary events. So in response to that, right, the demand to rally around the Constitution, defend the Republic, Kautsky says that the only way to defeat the right is to actually advocate democratic Republican principles. And he says that if we want to strengthen the propagandist power of the Republican idea, we have to show that the Republic we want, the Republic of 1793, the French Revolution, of 1848, the Great European Revolutions, and of 1871, which was the Paris Commune, that type of republic is fundamentally different from the republic of today. I think we could say something similar in regards to democracy. The type of democracy that we're talking about has nothing to do with this so-called democracy that we live in today. I will say very briefly that here Kautsky is laying out the differences, right, between a bourgeois republic, right, in which, among other minoritarian checks, legislative power is split, right, between an upper and a lower house, and one that's not, keyword not, based on universal and equal suffrage, and a democratic republic in which power is residing in a unicameral legislature elected by universal and equal suffrage. So I want to emphasize that not based on universal and equal suffrage, and yes, based around universal and equal suffrage. Kautsky says other things about the Democratic Republic. I'll only note that if we follow Kautsky, it's very interesting because he'll eventually flip and he'll go on to describe the state, in this case, Germany, as a democratic republic when it's so clear that the state he's describing is not meeting the standards he laid out in 1905. So you can really clearly compare the Kautsky of 1905 to the Kautsky of 1918 and see an inconsistency in what he's calling a democratic republic. So if you want to see how someone changes, right, Lenin calls him a renegade very famously. If you want to see how someone changes, that's a very interesting way to do it. So Rosa Luxemburg, this is from the Rosa Luxemburg movie. So in 1910, there's a massive demonstration for voting reform in Prussia. And I'll skip most of the background. The essential points is that Rosa Luxemburg says this is the moment to demand a democratic republic, similar to what Engels was saying. The Reichstag, the lower house in the German state, is not a democratic body through which we can pass meaningful suffrage reform laws, right? We have to look outside of it. We have to demand a democratic state. Kautsky and Luxemburg irrevocably split over this question. Now Kautsky says, actually, the Reichstag is a sufficient body through which we can make these demands. Luxemburg says that in Germany, the slogan of a republic, right, it's a practical war cry against militarism, navalism, colonialism, geopolitics, Junker rule. And she calls it only a consequence of the dramatic summation, or a dramatic summation of our daily battle against all individual manifestations of the reigning reaction. So I want to emphasize that she's calling the Democratic Republic a manifestation, a summing up of all those various battles. I'll try to speed us up here a little bit here as we come towards the end. I do want to focus, though, or put a special spotlight on the Socialist Party of America. It's remarkable, and there's a new book actually out about this. It's remarkable how much the SPA talked about political systems and the Constitution. It's remarkable how much everyone talked about the Constitution at that period of time. The SPA had a school where they had very famous folks, professors, teach classes on the Constitution. They had a newspaper in which they wrote articles about the Constitution, so on and so forth. Their 1912 program, though, is what I want to highlight. Here's a picture of the SPA in 1912. The SPA famously associated with Eugene Debs. Right, their 1912 program calls for the abolition of the Senate and the veto power of the president. Says that the president and vice president have to be elected by a direct vote. Says you got to abolish the power of the Supreme Court to retroactively go back on things, judicial review, essentially. And it says we need a new constitutional convention. So we need to rewrite the Constitution. And I will say that the SPA's program, along with Kautsky's critique of France, demonstrates what I think I said in the beginning, which is that this demand for a democratic republic, it applies to any country that doesn't have universal and equal suffrage. You can't say, oh, it's only applicable to a country with a czar, right? Because the United States and France do not have a czar, and yet at the same time, they're making this demand for a democratic constitution. So it's very interesting to see all the places where this demand is made. So what I want to do now is put everything together and kind of bring us to a close. Appreciate everyone sitting through me so far with us. So the classic Marxist strategy, as I've argued, was to achieve democracy in countries that weren't democratic. And the state form of democracy was a democratic republic where unimpeded lawmaking power resided in a unicameral legislature with representatives elected by universal and equal suffrage. That's my primary historical point. We also know that from Ian's presentation, that because the Constitution of the United States is not a democracy, right? We know that the American working class hasn't yet won, and this is a Lenin quote, the certain political rights that it needs to successfully fight for economic emancipation. We also know that the US has its own tradition of democratic struggle, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, the New Left, SDS. And it's basically all of this history put together that leads me to conclude that the strategy of achieving a democratic republic is still relevant, right? Because the United States is not a democracy. So what we need to think about, though, is what we're going to do with all this history. And I think we can sort of see three primary options in terms of what we do with this history that I've presented. The first option is to present a vision, right, of what life could be like in a future social society, and that would be the primary means by which we try and persuade people to become politically active. Right? We carry on thinking that a mass movement in the US will be built through the language of socialism, and that socialism is really the first thing that we should be talking with folks about. Or I want to ask us, should concrete demands for the immediate improvement of people's lives through electoral work, electoral campaigns, and legislation be the primary focus of our work, right? Trying to turn out the vote, push reforms, right? Is that where we should really focus our energy? Or, uh-oh, I spoiled it. I went ahead. Or should concrete demands, right, be coupled simultaneously with criticisms of our undemocratic political system to explain the lack of legislative progress and the necessity of democracy, right? Reforms, yes. Socialism, yes. But making that point that to realize either we need democracy, which is something we don't have in the United States. And as you might be able to tell by the bolded or, that's the one I'm going with, right? I think that concrete demands should be coupled with criticism of our undemocratic political system, right? And all that is a way to explain our lack of legislative progress and the necessity of democracy. So finally, to conclude, I wanted to do a little bit of meta commentary. So this is Luke stepping back a little bit from the slides. And just to say that this is a pitch, a conversation that I've had I've presented to many self-described socialists, right? And I recognize that some folks agree, some folks don't agree. It's fine. My goal, though, is to really get us on the same page historically. I think that once we have a common understanding of history, right, then we can disagree not on whether something happened, right, or whether so-and-so said something, but really if that history is still relevant, and then if what was said was correct or valuable. So, for example, someone might say, sure, I acknowledge the history, democratic republicanism used to be the strategy, but things have changed as evidenced by this particular history or this particular event. Or I acknowledge that Lenin said this, but hold on a sec, Lenin also said this. True. Or, I think Luxemburg was wrong and Kautsky was right. Or we might even just agree on some of these points. But when it's all said and done, each of us, I think, has a particular ideological center. I'm going to call an ideological center from which we communicate. And I recognize my ideological center as democratic republicanism. And therefore I communicate, right, using the language of democracy, right? I appeal to a desire for democracy and universal and equal rights. And I also think, as I hope I've persuaded you, that Lenin, Martin Luther King, and the best minds of SDS did something very similar. And I think that DSA can really only build a mass movement capable of fundamentally changing society if we tap into this ideological center. And to conclude, to do that, right, to tap into that ideological center, to build that movement, we can turn to the democratic republicanism of classical Marxism, also the lessons of the civil rights movement and the New Left. And as I've described, it turns out that history has been with us all along.